By 7 that morning, half the valley already knew what Daniel Mercer was doing. The old diesel pump coughed beside the pond, rattling hard enough to shake the rusted trailer beneath it. A thick hose disappeared into water the color of old tea, while another stretched downhill, spilling a muddy stream into a drainage ditch. Daniel stood at the edge in worn boots, watching the waterline creep lower against the bank. Behind him, a pickup slowed on the county road, then another. Nobody stopped to help. They stopped to watch. That pond's been there longer than any of us. Walter Briggs called from the other side of the fence. Only fool I know buys a farm and starts by draining the one thing holding water. 2 men beside him laughed. Daniel heard them. He kept his eyes on the pond. They weren't entirely wrong. Every farmer who had worked this valley seemed to have the same advice when Daniel bought the place 18 months earlier. Fix the south fence, clear the fallen timber, reseed the upper pasture, but leave the pond alone. It appeared on old property maps. Walter remembered fishing there as a boy. Daniel's former owner claimed his grandfather had watered cattle from it. To everyone around him, the pond was permanent. Daniel had begun to wonder whether permanent and correct were the same thing. By noon, several feet of water were gone. The pond that had once looked peaceful now looked wounded. Old branches surfaced first, then rusted fence wire, then decades of leaves and rotting vegetation appeared along the exposed banks. The smell arrived next, heavy, sour, ancient. Walter shook his head. "You're gonna spend $10,000 just to discover mud?" That got another laugh. Daniel almost smiled. Mud was exactly what he expected to find. What bothered him was something else. For months, he had watched this farm behave strangely after rain. Water rushed off the northern field so quickly that gullies formed along the slope, yet 70 yards away. A narrow strip of grass stayed green long after everything around it turned brown. The pond filled rapidly during storms. Then the surrounding ground dried as though the water had never been there. None of it made sense, not yet. Late that afternoon, the pump began sucking air. Daniel shut it down. Silence rolled across the farm. For the first time in generations, almost the entire bottom of the pond lay exposed. Walter and the others had gone home. Daniel climbed carefully down the slick bank. His boots sank nearly to the ankle. Black silt covered everything. He took 3 more steps and stopped. Across the bottom of the pond ran a narrow curved band, perhaps 6 feet wide. The mud there wasn't tea black, it was brown. Daniel crouched and pushed his fingers into it, beneath 2 inches of silt. He felt something coarse. He scraped harder. Sand, then small, smooth stones. Daniel looked toward the northern pasture. The strange band pointed directly toward the strip of grass that stayed green every summer. For several seconds, he didn't move. The pond was round, but whatever lay beneath it was tea, and suddenly Daniel understood that he hadn't drained the pond to find what was inside it. He had drained it to discover what the pond had been hiding. 18 months earlier, Daniel Mercer hadn't been looking for a mystery. He had been looking for somewhere to begin again. The 86-acre farm was impressive enough to attract anyone with better options. The pasture was tired. Sections of fence leaned toward the ground. Half the equipment shed roof was missing, and the farmhouse complained whenever wind came down from the hills. That was precisely why Daniel could afford it. He knew the place needed work. What he didn't understand was that the land itself seemed determined to make every problem arrive twice. The first summer exposed it. By late July, the northern pasture had burned pale beneath the sun. Grass snapped beneath Daniel's boots. Thin cracks opened between clumps of soil, and the cattle spent more time searching for forage than finding it. Daniel began hauling hay into fields that were supposed to be feeding themselves. Every load made the same uncomfortable thought harder to ignore. Maybe he hadn't bought a difficult farm. Maybe he'd bought a bad one. Then autumn arrived and the problem reversed. 3 days of hard rain sent water racing down the same dry slopes. Shallow gullies appeared almost overnight. Brown runoff carried soil toward the bottom of the property. Near the barn, Daniel sank into mud. Higher up, the ground was already drying again. Too little moisture when the grass needed it. Too much water when the soil couldn't hold it. And below all of it sat the pond. From the road, it looked like the one part of the property that worked. Nearly an acre of still water, willows along the bank, old grass around the edges. Daniel had assumed it would become an advantage. Instead, the pond seemed to collect evidence of everything going wrong. After storms, brown runoff poured into it. During dry weather, its level dropped, and because it sat below most of the pasture, using that water uphill required pumping. The pond held water, but the farm around it remained thirsty. That contradiction bothered Daniel more with every season. Then, one evening after a summer storm, he noticed something he couldn't explain. A narrow strip of green curved through the northern pasture. The grass around it was yellowing. That strip wasn't. Daniel knelt. The earth beneath his fingers felt cool, damp. He moved 20 feet sideways, dry. He stared at the difference. There wasn't enough shade to explain it. No irrigation pipe appeared on any map. Then another storm came, standing in the rain. Daniel watched water spread across the slope and saw part of it gather along that same almost invisible curve. From that day on, he began following it. Smooth stones, a shallow depression. 3 old trees aligned almost perfectly with the greener ground, and every time the rest of the pasture dried, that narrow corridor held moisture a little longer. Walter Briggs laughed when Daniel mentioned it at the feed store. "You restudying weeds now?" Daniel laughed too. But later that night, alone at the kitchen table, he unfolded every map that had come with the property. The pond was marked. The roads were marked. The fences were marked. The green line was T. Daniel traced its curve with one finger until it disappeared beneath the pond. Then his hand stopped. For months he'd been asking why the farm handled water so badly. That night, another question took its place. What had been there before the pond? For the next 6 weeks, Daniel did something his neighbors found increasingly amusing. He watched water. Whenever rain came, he pulled on his coat and walked the farm. He watched where puddles formed. He watched which gullies carried runoff first. He pushed wooden stakes into places where the ground stayed wet and marked others where the soil dried quickly. Slowly a pattern emerged. The green strip in the northern pasture wasn't random. It followed a shallow depression, so subtle Daniel had walked across it dozens of times without noticing, and every time it rained, that depression carried water toward the old pond. But something bothered him. The line didn't stop at the pond's bank. At least it didn't look as though it should. Daniel stood beside the water one evening, studying the opposite shore. Directly across from where the green strip entered, the pond was another low place in the ground. Beyond it stood a row of aging cottonwoods. They curved away from the pond almost like a trail. Daniel walked over. The soil beneath the trees was darker. He dug down with his pocket knife. A few inches beneath the surface, he found rounded pebbles mixed into the earth. He carried 3 of them back to the farmhouse. That night, they sat beside the property map on his kitchen table. Daniel stared at them for nearly an hour. He was too ready to call it a creek, not yet, but he had begun to suspect the landscape had once moved water differently. The pond might have interrupted or covered something much older. The next morning, Daniel visited Walter. The old farmer was repairing a gate when Daniel asked the question, "Do you remember what was there before the pond?" Walter stopped working. "What do you mean, before somebody built it?" Walter frowned. "Nobody built that pond. Somebody had to." Walter gave him the look reserved for men who had spent too much time alone. "My grandfather knew that pond. Far as I know, it's always been there." That answer stayed with Daniel always. It was a word people used when nobody remembered the beginning. 2 weeks later, Daniel found his first real clue. A storm dropped nearly 3 inches of rain overnight. At sunrise, he walked to the pond and found brown water pouring into it from the northern pasture. But along the opposite bank, near the cottonwoods, the ground was saturated far beyond the normal waterline. Daniel pushed a shovel into the bank. The first layer was clay. Below it came darker soil. Then his shovel struck gravel, not crushed limestone from a road, rounded gravel, smooth stones, the same kind he'd found beneath the cottonwoods. Daniel stood there in the rain, staring from the stones to the pond. Now the question wouldn't leave him alone. What if everyone had mistaken the visible water for the important part? What if the pond was sitting on top of an older drainage path the farm had forgotten? There was only one way to see what lay beneath decades of sediment. Daniel rented a pump. Walter heard about it before the machine was even delivered. "You're going to ruin a perfectly good pond chasing rocks," he said. Maybe Daniel would. That possibility frightened him more than he admitted. But the northern pasture was still failing. Topsoil was still washing downhill, and the strange green line was still pointing toward the same place. Daniel looked across the water. For 18 months, he'd been trying to understand what the farm was doing wrong. Now he wondered whether the farm had been showing him the answer all along. It was simply buried beneath the pond. By the time Daniel climbed into the empty pond, the afternoon sun had begun drying the exposed edges. The center was another matter. Each step made a wet sucking sound beneath his boots. Black silt clung to his soles in heavy slabs, and the smell of decomposing leaves hung so thick in the warm air that he could almost taste it. From the bank, the pond had looked shallow. Standing inside it, Daniel realized how much had been hidden. There were branches buried beneath the muck, fragments of old fence posts, a rusted horseshoe. Near the eastern bank, he found a length of wire so deeply embedded that roots had grown around it. Years had accumulated here, one layer at a time, but Daniel wasn't interested in what people had thrown into the pond. He was interested in the curved brown band crossing its bottom. He walked toward it. The difference became clearer as he approached. On either side, the mud was nearly black and soft enough to swallow his boots. Inside the band, the sediment felt firmer, brown instead of black, grainy instead of greasy. Daniel pushed a shovel into it. The first few inches came up as wet silt. Below that, the blade scraped against something harder. He dug again. Sand appeared, then gravel. Daniel dropped to one knee. He scooped away mud with his gloved hands until several smooth stones emerged. They were rounded, not sharp pieces of broken rock, rounded as if water had once spent years rolling them against one another. Daniel looked toward the northern pasture. The brown band entered the pond almost exactly where the strange green strip reached the bank. Then he turned around. On the opposite side it pointed toward the cottonwoods, the same trees beneath which he'd found those smooth pebbles weeks earlier. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself not to decide what it meant. One patch of gravel proved very little, so he moved 15 feet along the band and dug again. Sand, gravel. Another 20 feet the same. He marked each location with a wooden stake. By sunset, 7 stakes formed a gentle curve across the exposed pond bottom. Daniel climbed onto the bank and looked down. That was when the shape became impossible to ignore. The pond itself was roughly oval. The stakes weren't T. They entered from the northern field, curved beneath the deepest section, and continued toward the old cottonwoods, like a line drawn before the pond existed. A truck rolled slowly along the road. Walter stopped beside the fence. "Find your treasure yet?" Daniel glanced at the mud covering his clothes. "No," Walter grinned. "Told you." Daniel looked back at the 7 stakes. Maybe Walter was right. There was no treasure down there. No buried machinery, no chest of coins, nothing a man could pull from the mud and sell. But Daniel was beginning to think he'd found something more useful, a pattern, and patterns could tell stories. The next morning he returned with a longer shovel. Near the center stake he dug through the gravel until the hole was almost 2 feet deep. Then he stopped. Water was gathering at the bottom. Not pouring in, not enough to call a spring, just a slow clear seep appearing between the stones. Daniel crouched beside it. All around him, the pond bottom was drying beneath the morning sun. But this little hole was filling from below. For the first time since he'd rented the pump, Daniel felt genuinely uneasy, because the question had changed. It was no longer whether something had once carried water beneath the pond. The question was whether it still did. When Daniel returned to the test hole an hour later, 3 inches of clear water covered the gravel. He stared at it longer than he wanted to admit. Everywhere else, the drained pond was becoming a landscape of drying black mud and shallow footprints filled with dirty water. But this was different. Cool, clear, coming from below. Daniel dug another small pit farther along the curved band, dry a third. Water slowly appeared. He marked the wet locations and stepped back. Both sat directly over the gravel. That was enough to make him curious. It was enough to make him certain. For the next 2 days, Daniel resisted the temptation to tear the entire pond bottom open. Instead, he dug small test holes at intervals. The pattern followed him across the basin. Silt, brown sediment, sand, rounded gravel, again and again. Near the northern bank, the buried layer widened, beneath the cottonwoods on the opposite side. It narrowed before disappearing underground. Daniel could almost imagine the pond vanishing from the landscape. Remove the banks, remove the standing water, remove decades of mud. What remained looked disturbingly like a path. Walter came down that evening. Daniel handed him one of the rounded stones. Found these all the way across. Walter rolled it between his fingers. So, only along that line. Walter looked toward the stakes. His expression changed for half a second. "You thinking creek?" Daniel felt the answer rise immediately. He swallowed it. "I don't know." Walter gave him a sideways look. "Looks like you want to know." That was exactly the danger. Daniel had already spent weeks building a theory in his head. It would be easy now to make every stone prove what he wanted to believe. So he did the hardest thing he could think of. He stopped. For 3 days he dug nothing. Every morning, he measured the water in the test pits. The holes away from the gravel stayed mostly dry. Several along the buried band repeatedly collected moisture. Still, Daniel waited. Then the weather changed. Rain hammered the farmhouse roof through the night. Before sunrise, Daniel was already outside. Brown runoff slid across the northern pasture. He followed it toward the green strip. Instead of spreading randomly, part of the water gathered into the shallow depression Daniel had been watching for months. It curved downhill toward the empty pond. Daniel hurried after it. Water entered the exposed basin and spread across the black silt. Then it reached the buried gravel for one suspended moment. Nothing happened. A narrow current formed. It passed the first stake, then the second, then the third. Daniel stood motionless in the rain. The line he had been imagining beneath the mud was suddenly moving. Visible, real. The current followed the buried gravel across the pond before slowing beneath the cottonwoods, where it disappeared into saturated ground. Walter's truck stopped beside the fence. He climbed out. This time he didn't laugh. Daniel barely noticed him. He still couldn't say exactly what the buried feature was. A forgotten creek bed, an old drainage route, a naturally permeable corridor. The name mattered less now, because the storm had answered the question. Daniel could no longer dismiss. The pond hadn't created the path. The path had been there first. By Monday morning, Daniel had convinced himself he understood what the land was telling him. That was his first mistake. For months, he had watched water disappear from the upper pasture too quickly. Now, beneath the pond, he had uncovered what looked like an old drainage path running through sand and rounded gravel. The solution seemed obvious. Open the path, let the water move the way it had before. Daniel rented a small excavator. He began near the northern edge of the drained pond, carefully removing black silt from the gravel band. At first, everything seemed to confirm his theory. The farther he followed the line, the more gravel appeared. In places, the buried layer was nearly 8 feet wide. Small pockets of clear water seeped between the stones by afternoon. Daniel had exposed almost 60 feet of it. Walter watched from the fence. "You sure you know where that water's going?" Daniel shut off the machine. "No." Walter raised an eyebrow. "That's comforting." Daniel smiled, but the question stayed with him. Still, he continued. By sunset, he had created a shallow channel connecting several of his test pits. Water slowly gathered along the bottom. Daniel stood over it, feeling something he hadn't felt since buying the farm Progress. Then the rain came, not the gentle rain he'd hoped for. A hard summer storm rolled across the ridge shortly after midnight. Within minutes, water was hammering the roof. Daniel lay awake listening. Then he heard thunder and remembered Walter's question. Where was that water going? At dawn, he drove straight to the pond. His stomach dropped. The neat channel was gone. In its place was a jagged cut through the exposed sediment. Runoff from the northern pasture had entered the trench, accelerated through the gravel, and torn loose everything Daniel had disturbed. Mud covered the lower basin. Several wooden stakes had disappeared. One section of bank had collapsed. Worse, a brown plume of sediment had been carried toward the far side. Daniel climbed down and stared at the damage. He had wanted to reveal the land as old path. Instead, he'd created a shortcut for erosion. Walter arrived 20 minutes later. He said nothing for a while. That somehow felt worse than laughter. Finally, he looked at Daniel. Water doesn't care what you meant to do. Daniel stared at the washed-out trench. Walter continued. You give it speed. It'll take soil with it. Daniel knew that now. Finding evidence of where water once traveled was not the same as knowing how that water should be managed. Today the landscape had changed. Soils had changed. Fields had been cleared. Roads had been built. Whatever system had existed decades, or perhaps much longer ago, could not simply be uncovered and expected to work. Daniel spent the rest of the day repairing what he could. He blocked the deepest section with straw bales and branches. He spread loose material where the runoff had concentrated. Then he parked the excavator. For the next week, he didn't dig another foot. Instead, he walked. He returned to the northern pasture. He studied the gullies. He followed the green strip. He examined where water slowed naturally behind grass, roots, and fallen wood. For the first time, he stopped asking, how do I make the water follow this path? A better question had replaced it. How do I slow the water down long enough for the farm to use it? And that question would change everything. For 10 days after the trench failed, the excavator remained parked beside the barn. Daniel could look at it without remembering the collapsed bank. He had believed he was uncovering an answer. Instead, he had given the storm a weapon, so before sunrise each morning. Daniel went back to walking. Only now he walked differently. He stopped searching for places where water moved fastest. He began searching for places where it stopped at the highest point of the northern pasture. The land looked simple enough, one broad slope running toward the pond. But close to the ground, Daniel began seeing details. He'd ignored for 18 months a shallow depression barely deep enough to cast a shadow. Fine soil collected behind an old root, leaves caught against thick grass, small fans of sediment beneath bare ground, dark earth on the uphill side of fallen branches, and the cottonwoods. Daniel had always thought of them as old trees scattered across the farm. Now he stood back and looked at their positions. 3 followed the green strip above the pond. More continued beyond the opposite bank. He began marking everything with survey flags. Moist soil, gravel, vegetation changes, erosion, places where water had cut, places where it had slowed. By afternoon, the flags no longer looked random. Daniel climbed onto the bed of his pickup. For several seconds, he simply stared. The pond wasn't sitting at the end of the system. It was sitting inside one. Walter found him later with a notebook on his knee. No excavator. Daniel shook his head. No, finally came to your senses. Normally, Daniel might have defended himself this time. He almost smiled. I think I was asking the wrong question. Walter leaned against the truck. Daniel pointed uphill. I kept asking where the water was going, and I should have been asking where it stays. Walter looked toward the green strip. Daniel picked up a handful of dry soil. 20 feet away, thick grass had trapped leaves and fine sediment from the previous storm. Nothing spectacular, no engineered channel. No deep reservoir, just stems and roots forcing fast water to hesitate. That hesitation suddenly seemed more important than everything Daniel had uncovered with the excavator. His failed trench had given runoff exactly what it wanted. Speed. The farm needed something else. Time. Time for water to spread. Time for soil to absorb it. Time for sediment to settle instead of disappearing downhill. Time for roots to use what the storm had delivered. Daniel felt the embarrassment of his mistake again, but underneath it was something new. Relief he hadn't ruined the mystery. He had misunderstood the lesson. That evening he returned to the drained pond, the gravel still curved beneath the exposed silt. Only now Daniel no longer saw a buried ditch begging to be opened. He saw evidence of where water naturally concentrated. A clue, not an instruction. For generations everyone had looked at the pond and seen the place where water ended. Daniel finally understood that the more important story happened before the water ever reached it. The rain that finally gave Daniel his answer didn't arrive with thunder, it came quietly. A steady tapping against the bedroom window before dawn. By sunrise, Daniel was walking the northern pasture without a shovel, without the excavator, and without any intention of changing the land. He only wanted to watch. Water gathered near the upper fence. Small flows began moving downhill. Daniel followed them until he reached the green strip, then he stopped, 20 feet uphill. Water was already sliding across the surface. Here the ground behaved differently. Daniel pressed his boot into the soil. Soft, wet, but not flooded. Water seemed to linger here long enough to disappear into the earth. He followed the strip downhill. At every subtle depression, the same pattern repeated. Grass slowed the flow. Leaves collected. Fine sediment settled. Some water continued toward the pond. Some stayed behind. By the time Daniel reached the drained basin, a thin sheet of brown rainwater covered sections of the mud. Then he saw the test holes. Clear water was rising between the gravel. Not rushing through the trench he had dug, he'd already blocked most of that. This water appeared slowly from within the buried layer itself. Daniel crouched beside it for months. He'd wanted something dramatic enough to prove everyone wrong. Standing there, he realized the land had no interest in drama. Its answer was happening inches at a time. Walter arrived shortly after 9. "What am I looking at?" Daniel pointed. "Watch." They waited. Nothing exploded from the earth. No underground river appeared. No miracle spring burst through the mud. Only water quietly rising through stone. Daniel pointed toward the pasture. That wet ground follows the same line uphill, then toward the opposite bank, and it continues beneath those trees. Walter stared. Daniel finally allowed himself to say what he had resisted saying for weeks. "I don't think somebody put this pond in a random low spot." Walter looked at him. Daniel glanced toward the gravel. "I think they used a place where water was already collecting." Walter's eyes moved slowly across the landscape. The green strip, the gravel, the cottonwoods. Then something changed in his face. "My grandfather used to call that the wet run." Daniel turned sharply. "The what?" "The wet run." Walter looked almost embarrassed by the memory. "Haven't heard anybody say it in 40 years." For a moment, Daniel forgot the rain. "You never told me that." Walter stared toward the green strip. "Never thought it meant anything." Daniel felt a chill move across his arms. For months he'd been searching the ground for evidence. Now a name spoken by a man who had laughed at him had connected the present farm to a memory older than either of them. The landscape hadn't forgotten the water. People had forgotten the landscape. Daniel looked across the drained pond. He hadn't found buried gold. He hadn't uncovered some impossible underground river. What he had found was quieter, and somehow more powerful. Beneath decades of silt was a map no one had drawn. The land had written it itself. Daniel didn't restart the excavator. That surprised Walter more than anything for weeks. Everyone had assumed Daniel's goal was to uncover the old watercourse completely, to dig through the pond, reopen whatever had once existed there, and prove that he'd been right. But Daniel no longer cared about being right. He cared about what the farm was trying to show him. The erosion from his first trench had taught him something the gravel alone couldn't. Water moving quickly was powerful. Water moving slowly was useful. So Daniel changed his approach. He began at the northern pasture, where runoff first gathered after storms. Instead of cutting a straight ditch downhill, he worked across the slope. At several natural low points, he built small, shallow earthworks designed to interrupt the flow rather than accelerate it. Nothing dramatic. No concrete. No massive dam. Just carefully shaped ground, grass, stones, branches, and vegetation positioned where Daniel had already watched water, trying to slow itself. The first time Walter saw the work, he stared at it. "You reblocking the water now? Slowing it. Last month you were trying to drain it." Daniel smiled. "Last month I was wrong." That answer ended the conversation. Daniel also stopped thinking of the black pond silt as useless muck. Some of it was rich with decomposed organic material accumulated over years, but he didn't spread it blindly across the farm. He moved small amounts first. allowing the material to dry and testing it only in limited areas where it could be observed. Rather than trusted on assumption, he had learned what assumptions could cost. Near the old green strip, he disturbed as little as possible. That area had become his reference point. If the rest of the farm could hold moisture even slightly more like that narrow corridor, Daniel believed the pasture might behave differently during dry weather. Then he turned his attention back to the pond. For the first time, he understood why simply destroying it would make no sense. The pond still had value. It caught runoff, it provided water. It created habitat. The problem had never been that the pond existed. The problem was that everyone, including Daniel, had treated it as though it worked alone. He began reshaping only the damaged portions of the bank. He stabilized the area where his failed trench had caused erosion, and where the gravel band entered the basin. He avoided burying every clue beneath freshly moved soil. He wanted water to arrive slowly, not crash into the pond carrying half the pasture with it. Then they waited for rain. It came 9 days later. Walter drove over without being invited. The two men stood beneath the equipment shed as a gray curtain moved across the northern field. Within minutes, runoff began forming. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This was the first real test. Water reached the first shallow barrier. It slowed, spread sideways for a moment. Nothing seemed to happen. Then the soil began drinking. Farther downhill, the second structure caught what escaped the first. By the time the water reached the green strip, the brown torrent Daniel was accustomed to seeing had become several smaller flows. Walter said nothing. They walked toward the pond. Normally, after rain like this, muddy water would have been pouring down the bank. Today, water still arrived, but slower and noticeably clearer. Daniel crouched and picked up a handful of soil beside the green strip. Rain had soaked it deeply without tearing it away. That evening, the storm passed. The pond had begun filling again, but the northern pasture looked different. There were no fresh cuts through the exposed ground, no new fan of topsoil deposited at the bottom of the hill. The farm had received the same rain. What changed was the amount of time the water spent on its way downhill. Daniel stood beside Walter as the last drops fell from the shed roof. Walter finally broke the silence. So what happens now? Daniel looked across the wet pasture. Now we see what stays green, because the real test wouldn't have come during the rain, it would come when the rain stopped. The rain ended on Thursday. Daniel didn't celebrate. He had learned what early confidence could cost. For the next several mornings, he walked the northern pasture carrying the same soil probe and notebook. At first, the whole farm was green. That meant nothing. Any pasture could look healthy immediately after rain. The real answer would come later. Then the August heat returned. 3 cloudless days passed, then 5. The upper ground began losing color first. By the 7th morning, Daniel recognized the familiar pale cast spreading through the grass. Last summer, that color had kept spreading until nearly the whole slope looked exhausted. Daniel walked downhill, then he stopped. The grass below several of the shallow contours was still green. Not impossibly green, not the kind of transformation that belonged in a miracle story, just noticeably healthier than the ground beside it. Daniel knelt. He pushed the soil probe downward. It slid easily into the earth. 20 feet away, he tried again. The probe stopped sooner. He returned to the first spot and dug beneath the dry surface with his fingers. Cool soil. Moisture. Daniel remained on his knees. For weeks, he'd been measuring gravel, following runoff, repairing mistakes, and questioning whether he'd misunderstood the entire property. Now the proof fit inside one handful of soil. Small, quiet, but real. Over the next week, the difference became harder to dismiss. Grass stayed productive longer where runoff had been slowed. Low areas held moisture. Small erosion cuts that normally appeared after storms didn't return. And the old green strip no longer stood alone. Other parts of the pasture were beginning to behave like it. Walter discovered that without Daniel showing him. One evening, Daniel saw his truck stop beside the northern fence. Walter climbed out, walked across the pasture, and knelt in one of the greener sections. He pulled at the grass, pressed his fingers into the ground. Daniel approached. Walter looked up. You water this? No. Seed it? Not yet. Walter glanced uphill. Then why is it still green? Daniel pointed toward the shallow contour because some of the rain stayed here long enough to matter. Walter looked down again. Months earlier, he had laughed at Daniel for studying weeds. Now Walter was on his knees reading the same soil. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The next storm supplied another piece of evidence. Water still reached the pond, but it arrived slower. Clearer. Less soil came with it. The basin gradually began filling again. One evening, Daniel stood on the bank while insects moved across the returning surface. Behind him, patches of pasture remained green despite days of heat. The farm wasn't fixed. There were still fences to repair, poor soil to improve. Dry summers would still come. But one exhausting cycle had finally been interrupted. Rain runoff. Erosion. Dry ground repeat. Walter walked up beside him. "We thought you drained this thing because you wanted to get rid of it." Daniel looked across the pond. "So did I." Walter frowned. "What changed?" Daniel looked uphill. "I finally understood the pond was to the problem." He paused. "I just never understood what it belonged to." Walter followed his gaze toward the pasture. This time there was no laughter. By early September, the pond had water in it again, not as much as before. Daniel had deliberately kept the level low while repairing the damaged banks and watching how water entered after each storm. But every week the surface widened. Frogs returned first, then dragonflies. One morning, Daniel found tracks from a deer pressed into the soft soil near the western edge. The pond was coming back. Only now Daniel understood it differently. He no longer saw an isolated hole where rainwater collected. He saw the last visible piece of a much larger system. The northern pasture gathered rain. The shallow depression slowed it. Vegetation filtered it. The old wet run held moisture longer, and eventually part of that water reached the pond. The buried gravel beneath the silt had given Daniel the clue. But the entire farm had supplied the answer. He spent the next several weeks repairing the pond carefully. He softened one of the steep banks and stabilized exposed soil with vegetation. The section damaged by his failed trench received special attention. He wanted roots holding that ground before another heavy storm arrived. Most importantly, he resisted the temptation to make everything neat. There had been a time when Daniel believed improving land meant controlling it. Straight ditches, clean banks, water exactly where he wanted it. Now he understood that some of the most useful features on the farm were irregular. Curves, depressions, thick grass, old trees growing along forgotten wet ground. Things that looked untidy could still be doing important work. One afternoon, Walter pulled into the driveway. This time he wasn't alone. 2 farmers from farther down the valley climbed out with him. Daniel recognized both men. They had been standing beside Walter the morning he started pumping the pond dry. One of them had laughed when Walter said Daniel would spend thousands just to discover mud now. The man pointed toward the northern pasture. "Walter says you've been holding water up there." Daniel shook his head. "Not holding it exactly." He walked them uphill, mostly slowing it down. They stopped beside one of the greener sections. Daniel showed them where runoff had once cut through the slope. Then he showed them the shallow earthwork above it. He explained the mistake he'd made with the trench. He showed them the gravel band, the old cottonwoods. The line everyone had forgotten was once called the wet run. Nobody laughed. The second farmer crouched and touched the soil. "How'd you know this was here?" "I didn't." Daniel pointed toward the pond. "I drained that because I thought the answer was underneath it." And it was. Daniel considered the question. Part of it, he looked across the farm. The rest was everywhere. I just hadn't learned how to see it. By October, enough water had returned that the pond reflected the cottonwoods again. One evening, Walter stood beside Daniel on the rebuilt bank. The sunset turned the surface copper. "You gonna drain it again?" Walter asked. Daniel smiled. "Not unless it gives me another reason." Walter laughed. Not the same laugh as before. Then he became quiet. "My grandfather would have liked this." Daniel glanced at him. "The pond?" Walter shook his head. "You paying attention?" They watched the water for another minute. Then Walter asked the question. Daniel never expected to hear from him. "Think you'd come look at my south field sometime?" Daniel turned. Walter kept his eyes on the pond. "Got a patch down there that stays green when everything else dries out." Daniel smiled. Months earlier, Walter had laughed because Daniel was studying weeds. Now he was studying his own, and as darkness settled over the farm, the old pond sat quietly between them. Almost exactly where it had always been, but nothing about it meant the same thing anymore. By late autumn, Daniel's farm looked ordinary again. The pump was gone. The excavator was gone. Grass covered most of the scars around the pond, and fallen leaves drifted across water beneath the cottonwoods. Anyone driving past on the county road would have seen an old pond beside an imperfect farm. Daniel saw something completely different. He saw it in the northern pasture, where several sections had stayed green longer than the year before. He saw it where stormwater now spread instead of carving fresh wounds into exposed soil. He saw it along the curve Walter's grandfather had once called the wet run, and every morning. He saw it in the pond everyone had told him to leave alone. One cold morning, Daniel stood beside the water while mist hovered above the surface. Months earlier, he'd been convinced something important was buried underneath. At first, he'd imagined something physical. Then he found the gravel, the seepage, the smooth stones, the forgotten wet ground. But none of those things had been the answer alone. The answer was the connection between them. Footsteps sounded behind him. Walter approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Daniel. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Walter smiled. "You ever think what would happen if you listened to us?" Daniel looked across the pond. "Every time I come down here, you'd have saved yourself a lot of work." Daniel laughed quietly. "Probably, Then he looked toward the northern pasture. "But I still wouldn't understand the farm." Walter followed his gaze. That was the part Daniel valued now. He hadn't uncovered a magical spring. He hadn't found buried treasure. The farm hadn't suddenly become perfect. There would be more droughts, more storms, more mistakes. Understanding the land didn't mean controlling everything that happened to it. Daniel had already learned that lesson the hard way. It meant recognizing what the land was telling him, before forcing it to behave differently. Walter finished his coffee. So what was really under all that silt? Daniel looked at him. This time Walter wasn't teasing. Daniel turned toward the pond. History. Walter raised an eyebrow. Daniel pointed toward the pasture, just not the kind anyone wrote down. The mist began lifting. Morning light moved across the pond and reached the grass beyond it. For generations, people had assumed the pond was simply holding water. Daniel now understood it had been holding something else. A buried record, evidence of how water had once moved across the property, where it slowed, where it soaked in, where trees survived, where soil disappeared when the flow became too fast. Daniel had drained the pond, believing the answer would be something he could uncover, lift from the mud and point toward. Instead, what emerged from beneath the silt was something he could carry away. The hidden logic of the farm itself. The strange thing was that the property had been showing that logic all along, in the green grass, in the old trees, in smooth stones beneath the soil. Daniel simply hadn't known how to read it. The pond eventually returned almost exactly where it had always been. The farm looked much the same, but Daniel didn't, and once he understood what the land had been trying to tell him, he could never look at that pond or the farm around it the same way again.